Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa afdalu salatu wa tamu taslima ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina wa Habibina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. So yesterday, as many of you were there would remember, I had started I tried to say a few words about. Thank you. Try to say a few words about one important point and perspective from which one should begin one's engagement with the Qur'an. So before one actually occupies himself with the Qur'an and tries to derive benefit from it, one has to have the approach has to be correct. And the message yesterday, which I hope was clear enough, because we went into multiple directions while tackling that point, was that the Qur'an places the noble Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the very center of his enterprise. So it's the Prophet's Qur'an is effectively, in terms of its content, when one looks at the content of the Qur'an, the occasions for revelation and the guidance that was being revealed regularly over the period of the Prophet ﷺ's lifespan. The fact that the Qur'an started from the beginning of the Prophet ﷺ's mission and lasted till the very end of it. So it was revealed in not necessarily in a book format or in a one can say basically as the situations arose and as the needs arose, and all that points to the fact that the obvious fact that the Qur'an in its content is generally intertwined, even in some respects, with the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the conclusion, or the point that comes out from there was that
different backdrops on different days.
So the point that comes out of it is basically that one cannot approach the Qur'an in isolation from the Sunnah. So the Qur'an has to be approached through the Sunnah and the Seerah of Prophet ﷺ to be understood correctly. If one says that I'm just going to understand, open the text and read and try to completely ignore what the Sunnah says about it, one will find that every step, almost every page, one will be required to refer to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, to refer to the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, what is this actually talking about? وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ, when they are told, who are they? Who is they? So we have to look at who is telling them, what are they being told, etc. So the point is that the Qur'an cannot be approached except through the Sunnah, because the Qur'an is in its structure and its content. It's essentially it revolves around the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, the guidance there is universal, but the point is that the guidance of the Qur'an is inextricably linked, is connected to the guidance of the Sunnah. So they are collectively become a whole source of guidance. And then the question arises that, but this is what we covered yesterday. The question arises is that, and I mentioned that the experience of the first generation of Muslims, the people who received the Qur'an first, how was their experience of the Qur'an? They were experiencing directly from the Prophet ﷺ's mouth. The Prophet was telling them clearly, this is the Qur'an, this is not the Hadith. So the distinction between the Qur'an and Hadith was clear, but they experienced it from the person of the Prophet ﷺ. That was their experience. And so the ulama, they discuss this matter, because the Prophet ﷺ was tasked not only with relating the Qur'an, with reading the Qur'an to the people when it came down to him, but also to explain its meaning. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. We have revealed the remembrance, i.e. the Qur'an, to you so that you can explain to people what has been revealed to them. So the Qur'an, it's not its meanings, although its mubin is clear, it's in lucid language, but the intent, the language is clear, the message is clear, but to make sure that the message that the Quran is intending is delivered, the Prophet is tasked with the responsibility of explaining the meaning of the Quran as well, the intent behind the Quran or the revelation as well. So the scholars they debate amongst or discuss among themselves whether how the Prophet ﷺ fulfilled that obligation. Did he actually sit down with a group of companions, different ones at different times, and for every revelation he explained to them, okay, this is what has been revealed in a proper structured manner. Did he do that or not? Some say, well, he should have done that. Even if you don't know for sure whether he did it, it's not been reported, but of course, how else could he have fulfilled that obligation? But the majority of the scholars say that was not how the Qur'an was supposed to be. The meaning of the Qur'an, that لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ, was not supposed to be like a classroom lecture of delivering, of explaining that this is the wahi that has come today. This is its meaning. This is what it means. So it wasn't supposed to be like done in a lecture format. And the way the Prophet ﷺ did that was through making sure that everybody had access to his sunnah, and by demonstrating it through his own life. Because frankly, even Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu is reported to have said that I didn't know the meaning of this particular word in the Qur'an. I didn't know what this meaning was. But does that mean that the Prophet ﷺ failed in his obligation to discharge the duty of explaining the Qur'an? Of course not, because that was not essential. It was not considered essential to go through every single word of the Qur'an as such. But the general meaning and the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ captured the entire meaning of the Qur'an. And this is the meaning of the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha. She says that, describing the character of Prophet ﷺ, she says, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, i.e. whatever the Qur'an wants an ideal human being to be like, the Prophet ﷺ was. And whatever the Qur'an doesn't want a human being to do, the Prophet ﷺ stayed away from it. So, then the question arises that, fine, if the companions had access to the Prophet ﷺ to understand the Qur'an, we don't have that access, so how do we understand the Qur'an? How can we share that experience of the companions? Of course, we can't share the physical experience of being in the company of the Prophet ﷺ. But what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has facilitated for us, and this is the manner in which the meaning of the Qur'an has been preserved, is that the personal connection that was so essential to between the Prophet ﷺ and his companions to understand the meaning of the Qur'an. That physical connection, that scholarly tradition that we know as we know it today, has continued from the time of the Prophet ﷺ up to our day. And so the Prophet ﷺ's companions taught their students, who, and not students not in the sense of who came to study for them for a lecture or two. No, they stayed with them, they lived with them, they observed them, they saw their life, how they lived, etc. And their life was informed by the Prophet ﷺ's sunnah. And so that's how sunnah has continued, one generation after another, after another. And so finally the tradition, we have the scholarly tradition, what we call the scholarly tradition, but it's actually the lived tradition of sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And that has continued to this day. And so it is essential for us to derive to get the correct message of the Qur'an, to get the right guidance of the Qur'an as it was intended, to be part of this tradition, to attach ourselves to this tradition. It doesn't mean that everybody has to become a scholar, but this is the channel through which the meaning of the Qur'an, or the intended meaning of the Qur'an, would be made clear, would become accessible to us. Imagine, think of it as a well. Okay, the source is at the bottom of the well. We're trying to derive the water from the well. It doesn't make sense to cut the rope and say that I'm going to go directly to the source. Plunging in maybe seem like a good idea, but eventually that would result in end in the result that one is hoping to do. So the message that I am trying to get across with this is to say that when we speak about engaging with the Qur'an, when we speak about sort of occupying oneself with the Qur'an, one has to understand this in a broader sense, because engagement of the Qur'an actually means abiding by the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And that Sunnah as it has been conveyed to us through the tradition over the centuries. And so engaging with the Qur'an is a very practical thing. It's not primarily an intellectual thing. It's not primarily a mental thing or an academic thing. It's actually a lived experience of being living with the Qur'an, in the sense that the Prophet ﷺ lived with it. How his character, how his conduct was modified, shaped, molded by the Qur'an. We have to allow ourselves to be molded, make an effort, in fact, aspire to be molded by the message of the Qur'an, as it has been revealed to us through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and as through the tradition as it has come to us. And so that is an important perspective, that when we talk about engaging with the Qur'an, we don't make that connection necessarily. Sometimes it becomes difficult to make that connection. Okay, engaging with the Qur'an is an intellectual exercise. You open the book and you look at some of the ayat, you reflect on them, you ponder over the meanings. But then, what do those meanings actually mean for me? What do they mean for me in person? We have this tendency nowadays, I briefly spoke about this yesterday, to say that, okay, the Qur'an is a text, effectively. And so when I approach the text, I can pose my questions to the text, and the answer the text gives me will be the answer that is relevant to me. But the text is mute. The text doesn't speak. It's actually the answer that you're saying that the text is giving to you is a product of your own mind. So it's and this is just, this is the sort of the current contemporary hermeneutics. This is the approach that is taken. So the idea is that text is mute, the author is dead. We're not talking about the Qur'an, I'm just talking about any text now. The author is dead, his mind is inaccessible, his intent is inaccessible, so there is no point trying to find the intent of the author in a text, because you're not going to get it. So what is the text good for? What is good for? To give you some meaning, and so the meaning that you get out of the text is the meaning that's relevant to you. And even in the early sort of New Testament studies, even St. Augustine, etc., we find the references that yes, the scripture is there, but the meaning of scripture is what you get from it. So it's a very Protestant kind of idea, but it has origins much earlier than that as well. The problem, the reason why I raise this is that sometimes some people have either intentionally or inadvertently, without realizing, have brought that kind of thinking onto the Qur'an itself, and say that the Qur'an is also a text simply, and I can approach the text and derive meaning from it. Whatever meaning I get from the Qur'an is the meaning that's relevant to me, and we see that very common nowadays, particularly amongst people who are who present themselves or are represented as as spokespersons for Muslims and etc. So this is something that one has to be aware of. You don't need to focus too much on the negative, but one has to be aware that this is not the right way of approaching the Qur'an. Quran was a discourse, in a sense. It was not a text. It was responding to the needs of that was arising during the Prophet ﷺ's time. To different needs of different people, different companions, different questions posed, different questions or different situations that need to be provided guidance for, and so the Quran was doing that. So when we approach the Quran, we are approaching this discourse, of which Sunnah is also an integral part, and so our way of approaching the Quran should be a very practical one. That I need to engaging with the Quran effectively means living by the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Having said that, how can one benefit physically? Open the Quran. What can we do? What can we? How can one, in a much more narrower sense, how can one engage directly with the Quran as it is now, as it is available to us? And of course, when we say that in broad terms, or in effectively engagement of the Quran means living by the Sunnah of the Prophet, and Sunnah again understood in a very, very broad sense, not in a minor sense that what is the Sunnah for eating and Sunnah for drinking and Sunnah for salawat. No, Sunnah means lifestyle. Sunnah means the art of living that the Prophet ﷺ taught us and lived by. But that's approaching the issue from a very broad perspective. Engagement with the Quran, meaning living by the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, is, of course, that is the fundamental, and from a practical perspective, that is the only way only correct way of doing it, because ultimately it's about practice. It's not just about intellection, etc. But having said that, on the other hand, when we do approach the Quran as it is available to us today, how can we derive benefit from it? That's a separate question. That's a separate issue. When I open the Surah Al-Fatiha, for example, or Surah Al-Baqarah, and I read through, how can I derive maximum benefit from it? And these two things are not exclusive. It does not mean, when we say that the engagement with the Quran is actually to live by the Sunnah, it does not mean that the meaning of the Quran is inaccessible. That is not right, because there are some people who make a case for that and say that Quran it's too high. It's a forte of specialists, of scholars only, and only they can approach the Quran. One should not even think to reflect on the Quran, because it's just too high for us. It's not something that No, the Quran is not like that. Allah says in the Quran that it's made very clear, very lucid, and it's the message is very clear, in a very clear language, etc. But of course, there are necessary caveats that have to have. How much do we know the language? How much do we engage with the language? How much, if you don't know the language, and if you're just approaching the Quran through translations primarily, then how much accurate are those translations? How much can we be sure that what we're understanding or what the translator has conveyed is actually the intent of the Quran? All these things are there, but and they are all important questions and considerations. Having said all of that, Quran itself is accessible to everyone if we know what we are looking for. If we know what we need to look for in the Quran, the meaning is clear. And what some of the ulama, some of the scholars have said is that they've tried to give certain themes for the Quran, the overarching themes of the Quran can be found in the Quran. And one of them, and I think I just mentioned this so that it's helpful for us to understand to answer the question what we are looking for in the Quran. One of them is that the Quran essentially talks about 5 things, very, very broadly speaking, 5 topics. This particular author that I'm referring to, he talks about it, he calls it the ulum al-Quran, the 5 sciences. And that's again coming from a scholarly perspective. That's why it's called sciences, but it's essentially themes or topics. I think themes may not be the appropriate word, but basically what he says is that some of the ayat of the Quran are distinctly of a legal nature, are ayatul ahkam. So that's one category. So one can say categories, 5 categories. They are ayatul ahkam, and they deal with the legal issues. The other second category is the ayat al-mukhasama, which one roughly translate as dialectics. And what that actually means is that when the Quran is responding to the arguments of essentially there are 4 groups mentioned in the Quran. Of course, the first is the believers, the mu'minun. Second is 5 groups. First are the believers. Second are the mushrikun, the people of Arabia, the polytheists of Mecca and surrounding areas. Third are of course, the munafiqun, the hypocrites. who emerged later in the Meccan period or in the early Median period, and then grow in the later Median period. And then the people of the book, which are divided into Jews and Christians, those who were living in Arabia at that time, or the theological schools that were around, affiliated to these two religious traditions. And so the Qur'an engages. The people of the book is in two categories, the Jews and the Christians. And so the Qur'an engages with their arguments. It may engage with the argument of the mushrikun, that or it refutes their position, their arguments. So both ways, either they raise a question and an objection against the belief in Tawheed, for example, and the Qur'an responds to that in various ways, or the Qur'an criticizes their adoption of polytheism as illogical, etc. So that's one thing. Similarly with the munafiqun, similarly with the people of with the Christians and the Jews. And it also, on the other hand, so this is the second category, the category of roughly translating mukhasama as dialectics. And the third category, the remaining three categories are actually one, but they are sort of subdivided further. The third category is that of reminder. The Qur'an's objective is to serve as a reminder for us, to remind us about various things, but ultimately about the power of Allah, about the authority of Allah, about the need to abide by the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this category is then subdivided into three things. One is reminder, as this author puts it, bi ala'illah, by the favors and the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So enumerating and counting the immense favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done upon us, the blessings that we enjoy that have come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the second is bi ayyamillah, the days of Allah, literally translated, but in context it means the requital of Allah. So how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored the people who followed His commands and who lived by His instructions and in obedience to Him from the past generations, how He elevated their status in this world and the next. And on the other hand, how the people who disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who disobeyed the prophets that came to them, how they were punished. And so so one can say that from the historical perspective, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave each group or each people or each different nations in history what they had earned, etc. And the third is at-tazkir bil-mawti wa ma ba'dahu, eschatological perspective, that what will happen after death. So reminder through that reminder directly about afterlife, beginning from death onwards till Jannah and Jahannam and all the descriptions, etc. So these are three categories, but subcategories, but they all are of the same kind of reminder. Now, so these are very broadly speaking. Of course, it's not a very clear cut or precise, that nothing from the Quran escapes these categories. But generally, the message of the Quran can be related to, or can be seen as relating to one of these five categories. Let's start with the reminder. The reminder, the category of reminder is clear cut. There is no question of naskh, of abrogation in history and in any of them, in fact. So the way, not just the content of the Quranic content, not just the content that is related to these categories is clear cut, but also the style of delivering them is very powerful, very impactful, very strong, directed to us. in a manner that if we open ourselves to it, to this content, to the content relating to the category of reminders, it has immense potential to inspire us, to make us really reflect and ponder and think. So that is very clear, and that's most of the Quran is of that. Most of the content of the Quran is understandably, of course, because these are three categories combined into one. It's to do with that category, and so that category one can includes the stories of the prophets, includes the various ni'mah and the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has favored us, has given us, and everything to do with life after death. That is clear-cut, lucid, very accessible, very impactful, very powerful, and so one can directly, immediately benefit from that without having to consider anything else. So once we open the Quran, for example, Surah Hud, Surah Yusuf, these surahs, generally speaking, starting from the beginning of the 11th, beginning of Surah Hud, so and end of the 11th juz onwards, and carrying on, because there are certain surah in there which were revealed in Medina, which have verses of a legal nature and other things. But generally, these surahs are the primary themes that these surahs cover are to do with the category of reminders. And then, you come back to the second category, the muhasama. In the muhasama, the dialectics, again, that is very much clear what the Qur'an is saying. And even if it's in the sense that, of course, everything what the Qur'an says is clear. But what I mean is that one doesn't have to has to refer to a great deal to the particular situation of the Prophet's lifetime and his sunnah or seerah in order to make sense of these things. Often, if there is a refutation of a certain view that is part of these categories, Quran mentions that view. So, and even if one doesn't know exactly, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ. Okay, when they are told that don't create mischief in the earth, they say no, we are actually doing good. Very rough translation. So even if one doesn't know who these people are, the meaning is pretty much clear on its own, independently. One knows that if one has to be careful as to how one sees Islah and Fasad and all these things. But what would definitely enhance the understanding of this, if we knew what that particular Fasad, what the particular wrong thing that was being done by these people, and why they were objected to, and why they were told to stop and to desist from that. And so with this category, although generally the meaning is self-evident in many instances, one doesn't have to know what the hypocrites did in Medina to be able to understand Surah Munafiqun, for example, or the other surah, Surah Tawbah, for example, in which the acts of the Munafiqun are described and criticized at great length. One doesn't have to know that. But if one does, refers to these, one reads a book of Seerah, for example, or refers to the Sunnah, or has some knowledge, then that the meaning that can be derived from that is greatly enhanced by that. So with this category, that is the deal, as such, that the meaning is in most cases self-evident, but reference to the particular specific situations is definitely helpful to enhance one's meaning. And as for the first category, Ayatul Ahkam, that is something that again, Ahkam by their nature, they are divided into various categories. So there are certain things which are absolutes, which are the fara'id, other things are variables, they change in context, etc. And that is the area which is where particular expertise is essential, is required to not to understand the meaning of the verses. For example, there is an ayah in the Quran that generally is told, فَقْتُلُوا الْمُشْرِكِينَ حَيْثُ وَجَدْتُمُوهُمْ, for example. Okay, kill the mushrikeen wherever you find them. Right. that is to do with it's to do with an act. It's a legal, verse of a legal nature, etc. But that is not the meaning. It's not a universal command that wherever you and it's a complete. I mean, it's un-Quranic to take it as that, and it's un-Islamic, and we all know that. But so, what is the regarding the legal, and some say legal, ethical? Some people make that distinction. Content of the Quran that has to be that requires expertise in fiqh, and because that is, most of it is context dependent. For example, the Quran will say, the Quran says, "Aqim as-salat al-dhikri." So basically, establish salah, aqim salah, establish prayer, etc. Give zakat, etc. Now these are absolutes, okay? But how exactly is that supposed to be done? Quran doesn't talk about that. It's not mentioned in there. So how do we do that? Again, one has to refer to the experts. So this particular area, which is, some ulama have said this, roughly 500 ayat from the entire Quran, from the 6,000 plus ayats. So it's about roughly 10% or 12% of the Quran, which is to do with legal and as some say legal ethical content of the Quran. That in order to act by it, in order to put into practice, implement it, expert advice is essential. And one cannot simply read the Quran and say, okay, I'm going to act by that verse or what it tells me. Different examples. And I'm sure the point is clear enough that these ayat, they were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and then the Prophet ﷺ taught his companions how they were supposed to be interpreted, how they were supposed to be acted upon, etc. And in what situations, because ahkam, there are different various categories, ranging from fard, obligation, to haram, to impermissible. And in between there are various categories also. So in what context does this ayah fall in which category? That is something that a great deal of expertise is required. Nowadays there is a tendency, on the one hand we have the unfortunate situation where, like I said, the example I quoted, that's been taken literally and said, okay fine, we have to implement this, which is, as I said, completely un-Islamic and Quranic. On the other hand, we have this thing that these ayat are all context dependent. So for example, the ayat of mirath and inheritance, well, it was to do with that time and it's to do with the Prophet ﷺ's time and it's not applicable anymore. Well, no, so everything is context dependent, so we have to apply everything into our cultural context and all that. No, the Quran is making very clear when these ayat are being revealed, the Quran is being very clear that this is the hukm of Allah, وَمَنْ يَتَعَدَّ حُدُودُ, these are the limits of Allah, and whoever transgresses the limits of Allah, they are so and so and so and so, criticizing them openly. And so one can't simply say that these are context dependent. So the general idea is that regarding the understanding the legal and the ethical ayat of the Quran, expert advice is essential. Expert knowledge is required in order to be able to interpret the ayat that belong to this category, the ayatul ahkam. Generally, they are clear enough in their meaning, etc. But in their applicability, one has to always refer to the established authority. So, very broadly speaking, again. From these 5 categories, most of the categories are such that, or most of the ayat, they belong to the first four, depending which way you look at it, the category of reminders and the category of muhasama and engaging with others. Those are pretty much clear enough in the sense of, not just in terms of language, but also in the sense of their meaning and how they have to be understood. And the ayat that belong to the category of ahkam, they are distinct in that even though the meaning may be clear, the literal meaning may be very apparent from the ayat themselves, but how they have to be acted upon, how they have to be implemented, how they have to be actioned, that requires expert advice and more deeper scholarly engagement. So basically everything to do with fiqh has to be, one can't simply say that it's in the Qur'an, so I'm going to do it, or it's in the hadith, that's why I'm going to do it. It's a longer process. I mean, inshallah, when we have the opportunity, perhaps after Ramadan, if not during Ramadan, we'll speak a little bit about how the fuqaha approach these sources, how the jurists, how the ulama who are experts in fiqh, how they approach these sources and how they derive their guidance. It is not, just to make it clear, it is not simply a case of, it's in verse number this, ayat number this, surah number this in the Quran, or the hadith 4529, whatever in Bukhari or Muslim is there, and that's why it's going to be done. That is not the approach at all, and that's not the right approach. So one just has to be aware of that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to act upon and benefit from the Quran as opposed to, as it's the haqq of the Quran. Amin.
I don't want to got maybe a couple of questions if you have time. We have a next weekend as well, so we can continue this theme inshallah possibly next weekend as well. You kept mentioning expertise. So what's the route to that expertise today, nowadays? If somebody wants to, when is somebody ready, as it were, to be able to have that approach to the Quran?
No. When I say expertise, I didn't mean expertise to approach the Quran. Everybody, the Quran is open to all, and everybody is supposed to be approaching. Quran doesn't preclude anyone from approaching it. Of course, there are conditions and there are requirements. In fact, like you just reminded me, next week there is I have a couple of sessions I think next week. So we'll try to focus on one of them. What the Quran's own requirements are for accessing it. What the Quran says that it will do, the Quran itself, what it says it will do and how it will do it, and what are we supposed to do in order to unlock that guidance. So that's, inshallah, we'll talk about that. What I meant by expertise is it's in the context of fiqh, that it is not the case, like I pointed out at the end, that one has to, one can look at a certain verse of the Quran or a certain hadith and say that, okay, I'm going to act by that ayat of the Quran. What is actually required is a survey of everything, of the entirety of the source material available. This is the method of the fuqaha that I said we'll speak about later after Ramadan. But very briefly, the method of the fuqaha was not that go to the Quran, find a verse that talks about this particular matter and act upon it. And that's what, it seems, to some people at least, it seems a logical thing to do. That if I want to find an answer to a question, I open Sahih Bukhari, I find a hadith, I'll try to look for the chapter, and then find a hadith, and then say, this hadith, the Prophet did this. And that's it. So that becomes a prescriptive thing for me. I have to now, I'll go back and I can safely say that I can, regardless of whatever everybody else thinks, everybody else is wrong, they're all going to hell. I'm the right one because I found my evidence in Bukhari. Everybody else is acting without it. Completely wrong approach, completely incorrect approach. What the fuqaha very briefly did was that they, in order to answer one question, they would approach the entirety of the source material. How they define source material is also of course they differed amongst themselves regarding what they regarding the minor methodological issues. The broader framework was the same. But the minor thing issues that whether we take into account the fatwa of the companions, whether we take into account what the companions, if a companion is practicing different to what he has reported, what does that mean in terms of, so these are technical matters. But generally what they did was, if one issue came up, first of all, they made sure they had a very clear sense of what was the question they were asking. Unfortunately, it seems to be the very obvious thing to do, but it's not being done. So people say, have a particular view in mind, a particular thing in mind. For example, I'm just mentioning this because somebody asked me the other day that a person had came to the mosque with the shirt, with the Lacoste T-shirt on. He had the alligator sort of I don't know what is embroidered in it. Okay, he was in a picture, and somebody said, "Oh, your salah is not done. You have to go back. Okay, you have to pray your salah. You have to remove the T-shirt and pray salah. Not in the mosque, but go home and so so the person came and asked me, I said, well, no, it's fine. So then there was a discussion, a civil one, not a very heated one, as these often tend to be. But so I asked him, okay, what is the actual question that you objection? And his point was, oh, it's a picture. Okay, what is the definition of a picture? And that is it. That, one hadn't thought through what actually one was saying, and that was a sort of just an example. But the question is, one has to be very clear what the fuqaha were very clear. What is the question that they were asking? What is the problem that is there? In this case, the problem was a picture, but what was the definition? What made a picture a picture? That was not well thought through. So they were very clear about what the issue was. Then they sought the answer from the entirety of the tradition. They didn't go to a Qur'an and say, okay, this ayah talks about this matter, so that's it, that's the answer. No. They said, okay, fine, that ayah talks about that. But there is also some connection, indirect connection with this ayah to this also, to this issue. There is a hadith which is completely about something else, but it bears upon this matter. Okay, there is a hadith which is directly talking about this matter, but it's talking in a very specific context. So, and once you have identified from the entire, again, this is a very, very vague idea, a very sort of generalizing, very general way of putting it. From the entire pool of the available resources, whatever they have identified relevant to this, not directly but also indirectly, they would just take it out of the larger pool and then consider it in that context and say, okay, this issue maybe in this particular context, this could be the answer to it. But if the context changes, then the answer will also change. This will be the answer to it, so etc. So they looked at the every single issue holistically. This is the way of the fuqaha. And that is what I mean by expertise, that one has to, I mean, of course, one can't, this is what the mujtahideen do. The mujtahids, i.e. the highest authority in fiqh, they will approach these issues like this directly through the sources. Not everybody can develop that capacity, and as time passes by, it becomes difficult to do that naturally. We don't have all the available resources. For example, all the hadiths that was available to them with the level of strength that they were available to them are not available to us. Similarly, all the opinions and in fact many of the chains of hadith, not the hadith themselves, not the sunnah itself, but the chains of hadith may have become lost. Books were destroyed. The biggest collections of some of the biggest collections of hadith in the 3rd century, 4th century are not available anymore. The Sunan of Baqi ibn Makhlad, which was greater than the Musnad. Baqi ibn Makhlad, which is greater than the Sunnah than the Musnad of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, which is in itself published in varyingly in between 25 to 30 volumes or 20 to 30 volumes. This Musnad of Baqi ibn Makhlad was larger than that, and that's lost entirely. It's not available. We don't have it anymore. So as time passes by, it becomes difficult to and so what we then have is that we have the considered opinion of these groups of initial scholars with their evidence bases and how they have presented their case and made their arguments, and then later scholars they derive from that. So it's that is the meaning of expertise that I was talking about. To cut a very long point short, that in fiqh the expertise that is required is because fiqh is not about simply going to a source material source in the Qur'an or Sunnah and saying, or Hadith, or saying that this is what I'm going to take and implement directly without consideration of everything else. It requires a much more nuanced approach. So it was particularly on the issue of fiqh. Otherwise, one doesn't have to be expert in any manner to be able to derive. Of course, the greater one's expertise in language and awareness of surah and sunnah, the greater one's benefit from the Quran directly. But otherwise, it's there for it's open to all. Any other questions?
Inshallah, we'll see you again next Saturday.
Inshallah.
Next Saturday we've got this iftar. We'll be doing a slightly later start time. We'll circulate the information about that.
Inshallah. And we'll be at the Asian cultures.
Yes.
سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد ان لا اله الا انت نستغفرك ونتوب اليك